Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to the Governance Audit Stance Committee. My name is Councillor Will Purvis. I'm the new chair of the committee. Before we start, a few of the usual bits of housekeeping. If the continuous fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the room and public gallery by the stairwells. Please do not attempt to use the lifts. The assembly point is at the Queen Victoria statue in front of the civic offices. Also, if you signed in on the way in, please remember to sign out when you leave the building. Live web streaming. Can I draw everyone's attention to the fact that the meeting will be live streamed from a camera at a fixed location at the back there, and recording will be placed on the council's website afterwards. The camera will mainly capture the back of people's heads if public making deputations, etc., but please be aware that you may be filmed. Members of the public are also permitted to record the meeting on the understanding that it doesn't disrupt the meeting, and the records explicitly state if someone says that they do not wish to be recorded. Also, can everyone remember to use the microphones? I'm going to try and remember as I go through this, because I know if I don't turn mine off, you can't speak. And from there, perhaps if we go around the table, it would be useful for everyone to introduce themselves, starting from my left, John.
Councillor John Ferret, Councillor for Paulsgrove.
Councillor Simon Bowsher, Drayton and Farlington.
Councillor Ken Elcombe, Drayton and Farlington.
Councillor Hugh Mason, St Jude Ward.
Councillor Ian Lyon, Nelson.
Kelly Nash, Performance Manager.
Michael Lloyd, Finance Manager for Technical and Financial Planning.
Julian Pike, Deputy Director of Finance.
David Morman from the Procurement Department.
Greg Povey, Procurement and IT.
Paul Somerset, Deputy Chief Internal Auditor.
Elizabeth Goodwin, Chief Internal Auditor.
Helen Thompson, Associate Partner from EY, we're your external auditors.
David White, External Audit Manager.
John Bell, Director of HR, Legal and Performance.
Michael Lawler, Deputy Chief Executive.
Vicky Plutas, Democratic Services.
Thank you. Item number 1 is apologies for absence. Given that everyone is here, I'm assuming we have no apologies for absence. Item number 2, declarations of members' interest. Do any members have a pecuniary interest to declare in items on the agenda today? No. Excellent. Takes us on to minutes from the meeting held on the 9th of March. I'll be honest, I'm looking at Hugh here as the only person who was here last time.
Chairman, I believe they are a correct set of minutes. However, there are a number of matters which I think arise from them, which we should deal with today.
Thank you, Hugh. In which case, let's flick to the minutes. Sorry, Michael, do you want to lead us through the actions? I'm just quickly flicking through them, but having not been at the meeting, not knowing the context of the actions.
Sorry, I put on my microphone. If we just go through them page by page, Chairman, that might be helpful.
Chairman, I wondered, since Councillor Mason has actually done a list of the matters arising that he thinks we get dealt with, perhaps we might refer to him.
Great.
By all means.
Thank you, Chairman. On item 21, Treasury Management Policy, Mr. Lloyd was going to contact the bank again, the top of page 9 or page 5, whichever it is for you, and would provide members of the committee with an update on progress. I trust this will be done. A couple of bullet points down on that page. The committee would receive notice of any breach at its next an update to its next meeting, and we have not had a note on that as yet. We have had a note under item 22 on the municipal energy supply company, but I think that this is a matter of sufficient import that we should keep this on the agenda and ask for an update, a briefing note on how the company is developing in relation to the international and national energy markets at each of our meetings, so that we can keep track of the fact that it is or is not on track. Thank you.
Happy to do that, Chairman.
Do we have any update on the other points about getting back in contact with the bank? And
Yes, we do. We have spoken to Lloyds Bank, and due to a number of favourable factors, we've managed to secure interest of 0.8% fixed for a year.
I think, excuse me, Chair, I think regarding the second item about advising breaches of the Treasury management policy, I think that was clarification of the report that said that in the event there were any breaches, that the notification would be made, not that we would be getting back to this committee with any notices of breaches, because there haven't been any.
Okay, Chairman. I think that this again is something which needs to be on our agenda for each meeting. Any possible breaches should be brought immediately to our attention.
Yes, Chair, that's of course, yes, we can do that.
I think the energy company point is probably going to come up later anyway. I'd flagged that it's part of the audit plan for this year, and I know it's something that I've heard a number of members have raised with me, so perhaps we'll come to that later as well. Is there any other matters arising actions from the last meeting that you think we need to cover? Members happy to agree the minutes of the last meeting, bearing in mind only one person wanted. Agreed. Excellent. Takes us on to item 4, External Audit Progress Report. Would you like to introduce this?
I believe there was a deputation. Should those be taken now, or should they be taken when they arise in the agenda?
Good point. I actually spoke to Mr. Brown earlier, and I think he's happy to give all 3 deputations, I think it is, at this point in the meeting, if that suits members, and refer back to them later on. Brown?
Thanks very much. I should say that I've spoken to Mr. Povey about the deputation that affects his area yesterday at some length on the phone, and that was very useful and addressed most of the questions that I had. So that was really very good indeed. Okay, so I've got 3 deputations today, one about Treasury Management Outturn, one about the Annual Audit Plan Report, and one about Performance Management. So straight into these, I expect each one to be under 6 minutes. So agenda item 6, Treasury Management Outturn Report. In the section that's actual capital expenditure, and by the way, page numbers I'm referring to are those of the page numbers that are in the report pack, not the individual documents that you've received. So it's the overall page numbering from the large PDF that I'm referring to. So on pages 31 and 32 of the report pack, the report states, although the Council is responsible for ensuring the LEP's grant income is spent appropriately and has a veto on the LEP spending, it does not control the LEP. And then further on page 31, the report says that 33.4 million less grants and contributions were applied to finance capital expenditure than had been included in the revised capital programme. This was largely due to the LEP, the Local Enterprise Partnership, for which the Council is the accountable body, underspending on schemes which would have been financed from grants and contributions. So by my reading, that says the LEP underspent by pretty much £33.4 million. That's a huge amount of money, which would have come from grants and contributions and so has little financial impact on PCC, or at least negative financial impact, that hasn't been spent in our region supporting growing businesses. Local entrepreneurs are desperately seeking capital and yet finding it hard to meet the LEP requirements despite the excellent efforts of many of the LEP staff. Perhaps PCC and others involved with the LEP need to find a better way to help ensure that the LEP fully spends its budget. I understand that it says that spending's been deferred to another year, but it's money that wasn't spent last year. Supporting new businesses and helping create jobs and tax revenues in our area. I'd ask please that PCC representatives on the LEP come and explain to GAS and members why it wasn't possible to spend what had been in budget or to spend it on something else. Deputation number 2, agenda item 7, annual audit plan report. First of all, it was great to see the audit so complete in the execution and its recording. Absolutely great. So on page 46 of the reports pack, at item number 6.1 onwards, there are 7 agreed actions put in place to help address the 1 critical and 6 high-risk items that resulted from the IT audit. This is the subject that I spoke at length with Mr. Povey about yesterday. All of the exceptions recorded are astounding. The company destroying PCC's old computer hard drives doesn't have a contract, policies and procedures are out of date, nearly 40% of IT assets aren't in their recorded location, the data held on the assets is significantly incomplete, and more than £8,000 of new computer equipment is unaccounted for, and old hard drives containing sensitive data are not being tracked properly. I understand all of this is now being addressed, but this was written before I understood that. But it's my regular plea, if an action is put in place, then please, can we have a completion date and a responsible director and some indication of how the reporting and the mitigation is going to be made? It's no good just saying it'll be done. We need to see it come back and demonstrate that it has been completed, and we need to see a date along with the action. In page 47 onwards of the reports pack at item 6.2, MMD recruitment, the report highlights, and I quote, a fundamental lack of process and control in relation to recruitment, with some of the recruitment agencies not having a demonstrable contract and some of them overcharging. And at item 6.3 on page 48, the report states, and I quote, contracts over £30,000 were required to be approved by a director. However, it wasn't possible to establish details relating to the quote or the tendering process. It also wasn't possible to obtain documentation to show at what level staff could seek quotes, how many comparative quotes should be sought, how suppliers should be sourced, and at what financial level contracts should be put out to tender. There's currently no review of supplier performance by way of a formalised key performance indicator process. Now, that's a damning quote from the audit. Only 7 out of the top 10 suppliers to MMD have a demonstrable contract with MMD. £2.7 million every year is being spent without a contract. Only 5 of the top 10 suppliers had been set up on the system, 2 of which weren't authorised properly anyway. So only 30% of the top 10 contracts are properly established for what is our largest external major business. Perhaps GAS could insist that truly independent directors are appointed to MMD and all the other commercial businesses that we have, not merely members or officers without being offensive, as in my opinion this may help address some of the issues known but unspoken of. Deputation item 3. Agenda item 8, performance management update. On page 206 of the reports pack, it's a big reports pack, 300 pages. How members are supposed to read it in 2 hours, I have no idea. Anyway, on page 206, it says that transparency information is being delivered on time, yet the nature of the reporting has changed recently, such that and people will be familiar with this, such that the supplier ID field is redacted from those suppliers classed as sole traders. And when I asked for the majority of the names to be included, I was told, and I quote, the guidance issued by the LGA says that sole traders can be named as long as their business is in the public domain, but the advice of the Information Commissioner's Office is that the address of the sole trader shouldn't be published. So what PCC does is it puts the address of the sole trader into the name field, and then it says, well, the ICO says we can't publish that because that would be publishing their address. and it's too much work to take them all out. And I'm going, this is so Kafkaesque, it's unbelievable. Come on, guys, do the right thing. Do what the law says you should do, and don't hide behind this to hide who the suppliers are. There's something I really would like Gas to address that. It really is just unacceptable that major suppliers, and not just sole traders, but also organisations classed as vendors, 122 in the last published report, had no name on there. It was redacted. I agree maybe with some of the sole traders, but vendors, hundreds of thousands of pounds every year, untracked. We're not told who they are. We know mostly what the subjects are, but they won't tell us who the vendors are. That's not right. So page 210 in the reports pack, we're still on agenda number 8. There are quite a few IT performance metrics, and yet, if you remember earlier in the reports pack, we read of critical and high risk findings in the red, yet in the performance report, everything in the garden is very rosy indeed. Perhaps we should have performance metrics that address the shortcomings identified by the audit. It's difficult to see how an audit can create things that are red and the performance reporting says it's all green. They just don't match up. So agenda item 8 still on page 229, appendix 3, we read about the hard interchange project, and it says construction is complete and the terminal is in use, snagging defects identified are being addressed. Yet it's well known that there remain significant faults with the completed building, including the lack of cathodic anodes and the constantly in need of repair roadway. Last I heard, this was the subject of some robust conversation, and perhaps that should be reported here. Almost lastly, but not quite. I didn't see any reference to BAR in the audit plan. Given that compensation payments of over 1.1 million were made to businesses moved to clear the land for BAR, one wonders where such payments feature in the payments to suppliers report, because I frankly couldn't find it. I had the dates when they were supposed to have been made, and I checked the reports for those months and they weren't there. So how we've reported those things, I think, is something I'd like to see come up. Also, some of the payments featured into payments, where such payments do feature in payments to suppliers, or indeed, one wonders how things like in the report I got, which wasn't in the payments to suppliers report, we have items like 5 containers to rent at £1,800 each, coming to a total of £3,600. Or 6 containers at £3,250 each comes to a total of £6,500. Even I struggle to work out how they got to that number. And there's a reference to where you can find that report if you want it. Lastly, in agenda item 8, in still, we have on page 237 the report on the Municipal Energy Company. This business that is planned to burn over £5 million in start-up and trade with up to £26 million of risk, that isn't subject to FOI because it's a private company, whose directors are not subject to normal recruitment processes, and whose oversight includes no external involvement, has as its only reporting that the final business case was agreed and the project is on track for launch in autumn 2018, and that the key risks are progression to controlled market entry and not achieving target uptake. Well, frankly, that's unacceptable. If I were in charge of a business with a subsidiary such as this, a project that was starting, I would expect my audit partners to be all over it and ensuring that adequate reporting within the bounds of commercial sensitivity be provided to members. Yet there's been nothing other than these few words. I'd be asking, if I were on Gas, just who approved the final business case, what oversight's in place, what reporting will we expect, both regularly and by exception, and additionally, given the nature of the business and its fundamental reliance on a handful of people for its future success, surely one of the key project risks should include the loss of those key staff and a mitigation plan for if that happens. So, as a comment, if PCC is going to run things as a business, then it has to become more business-like. In a major corporation for a start-up project of this size, I'd expect as a minimum a monthly 45-minute review with the financial director, the division president, or the CEO, the head of legal, the head of HR, the head of programme management, and 2 members of the team. And I would expect to see reported for this £5 million start-up project, spend against budget, activities against plan, new risks, and any changes to environment or timeline. But none of that has been reported. I'm getting to the end. And each month, I would expect that review board to decide if the project should continue or not. It shouldn't just continue on willy-nilly. If it looks like it's heading for failure, it should be halted, regardless of the sunk costs. That's what you do in a major business with a big project. The risks inherent in this project are significant, and there is little reporting and no external independent directors. This would be unacceptable in a business context, and it should be unacceptable here. If in Victory Energy we are going to avoid the problems, last paragraph, if we're going to avoid the problems we've seen in MMD and in the roads programme, then PCC need to put more effort into managing this significant project in a more commercial fashion, as a matter of some urgency, failing which it risks falling into the same problems as previous forays into non-public sector areas, all of which become very steep and very expensive learning curves. That's it. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Okay, that takes us on to item 4, which I preemptively tried to get onto earlier by mistake. External Audit Progress Report. Back over to our external auditors to introduce this one.
Thank you, Chairman. So I'm going to talk through the progress report, and then Helen will speak about the fee letter, which is our second paper. So our first paper today is just a brief progress report covering our 17-18 financial statements audit, our work on housing benefits, and introducing the fee letter, which follows. So on your page 22, there is a very brief summary at the top covering our 17-18 financial statements audit. We brought a longer summary of where we were with that to the previous meeting, so we won't repeat that here. Our interim visit took place in February, and good progress was made in terms of trying to pull work out of the June and July peak. There is an earlier deadline for completion of the audit and sign-off of the accounts this year, being 31st of July, and previously that had been 30th of September. So there is an onus to try to cover as much as we can earlier in the year to relieve the pressure during that peak time. The deadline remains a challenge, obviously, but as I say, I think we made good progress in February, and we were very appreciative of the help we were given by officers in doing that. The dates for our year-end visit are unchanged from before, starting 25th of June, completion by 27th of July, bringing our audit results report to your meeting on the 27th, and then the national deadline for sign-off and publication of the accounts is the 31st of July. In the next paragraph, a brief introduction to our 18-19 fee letter. This was submitted to the Chief Executive at the end of April. It covers only the fee for the 18-19 financial statements audit, because the housing benefits subsidy work is subject to a separate contract from 18-19 onwards, and we'll come on to that in a moment. And I think the main headline is that under the joint procurement led by PSAA, the result of that is a 23% year-on-year fee reduction compared with 17-18. The last paragraph on page 22 just briefly covers where we've got to so far on our 17-18 housing benefit subsidy claim certification. We started work on that in April. We've completed about a quarter of the required initial testing. Sample sizes there are sort of mandated under the DWP and PSAA approach. Our next planned visit is in August, and the ultimate deadline for sign-off of the certified claim is the 30th of November, which is unchanged from previous years. And then on page 23, just to note that Portsmouth City Council led a joint procurement exercise covering most of the authorities in Hampshire for the housing benefits work for 18-19 onwards. That process is ongoing. We've submitted our tender by the deadline of the 21st of May, and it's at the evaluation stage at the moment, so the outcome is pending. Happy to take any questions on any of those.
Members, any questions? Councillor May.
You are 25% of the way through the housing benefit subsidy claim certification. Are there any matters which are showing themselves which give you any cause for concern at the present time?
I can confirm that there are not. No issues arising at this stage. A certain number of small errors are well within expectations as part of any housing benefit subsidy certification because of the complexity of individual claims and the system under which the council has to operate housing benefits. but there is nothing of particular significance identified so far.
Thank you, Chair. Just in terms of meeting this target, because we remember what happened last year, where we overshot the sign-off date for the accounts. I think I signed at least 2. It might have been 3 versions of the accounts, but there was considerable work that was required after that date. I've just a bit of a concern that we're looking at the 27th of July in terms of presenting them to us, and then they have to be signed off by the 31st. I recognise there were, in terms of things that were discovered in the way the order of the audit, my understanding was some of the more difficult work was left till late, and then hence there was the requirement for more work after the sign-off date. So I just want to be clear that, and I'm hope you can give us reassurance that in terms of the order of the work, that there's no concerns there. And in terms of meeting this date, you've described it as a challenge, but if you can just give me a bit more insight into the scale of that challenge.
So it's a bit tricky because obviously we brought a detailed report to the last committee meeting, and a number of people either weren't there or have changed since that meeting. So I think if you were to go back to the report we presented to the last meeting, it sets out a lot of the work that we have brought forward. The area that caused us most concern last year was all around property, plant and equipment and the capital accounting. We have started a lot of that work early, so there's been early work done around valuations, and we've had much closer working and arrangements and meetings with Jules, Michael and his team to understand whether there are any areas of contention, if it's sort of within the way in which they have accounted for things. So, the most complex area last year was around the White Link lease. I don't think there is any transaction as complex as that in this year's financial statements. So we say that meeting the 31st of July is a challenge because it is. There are, as a firm, we have to deliver over 180 opinions by the 31st of July across the country, and that is a lot to do. For each individual council, you have had to reduce your timescale by a month. We've got to reduce ours for 2 months by 2 months for everybody. But I am as confident as I can be that we have brought as much work forward as we could have done in the interim stage. The team has worked very hard to get us into a place where it's mostly top-up testing, where we can do that, and focusing in on the disclosures within the financial statements. The timing of the committee is obviously a choice for the council, and actually works quite well. Our biggest risk is that if we have overrunning audits that are running earlier, so councils that maybe started in early May or at the beginning of June that overrun, that could then cause an impact for those councils that are running towards the end of the process, of which you are one, but not the only one. We have been very clear with those councils where we are starting early that we will leave on the date that we said we would leave. And again, we have said that, I think, to this council because you are the ones that would be impacted. So I can't give 100% assurance, but I am confident. I could give 100% assurance if we were still working for a 30th of September deadline. For a 31st of July, it only takes a member of staff on our side to perhaps go sick to cause us some issues that we then have to try and resolve. But I think we are in a very good place compared to where we were last year.
And can I just check? I mean, last year we were told that missing the deadline was sort of reputational. There were no other sanctions in place. Is that still the case? If you miss the deadline, then that's a reputational issue, or are there any sanctions as part of the new regime?
There are no changes to the sanctions, so it still remains broadly a reputational risk rather than anything else.
Thank you, Chairman. Can I just confirm, because I read it somewhere, I think, in this 272-page document, when we talk about housing benefit in terms of quantum, am I right in thinking we're talking about £105.6 million that we're actually auditing? Is that correct, or am I barking up a completely wrong tree?
I think that sounds about the right sort of figure in terms of the council's total subsidy claim that it submits annually.
So, can I follow up then I've been off this committee for a year or so, and therefore had to rack my brains to remember various bits, but how, when you're talking about your audit specifically of this particular process, what's the sort of sample size are you talking about in terms of the 105.6 million? I don't know how many claims that is, and I don't know how much the average claim would be. So could you give me a kind of overview of that, please?
Yes, I mean, I can't tell you how many claims are in the council's caseload off the top of my head, but it would be many thousands, and, you know, they would range from very small amounts, probably up to multiple thousands, probably approaching 10,000 in certain cases where people are entitled to full benefit throughout the year. The samples that we test are, so the size of the samples that we test are mandated by the approach which we and all other audit firms have to follow in certifying a housing benefits claim, and it's set out by PSAA and the DWP in their HB count methodology. So for every type of benefit that the council has, be that housing revenue account rent rebates, homeless rent rebates, or rent allowances for tenants in private accommodation, we test 20 cases at random from the population in each of those areas of the claim. And then for any errors which are identified, which cannot clearly be shown to be isolated because of their peculiar circumstances, the general approach there is to test a further 40 claims, and that work focuses on the specific nature of the error identified. So if we found an error in the calculation of somebody's earnings in rent allowances, we would select a further 40 cases with earnings in that part of the claim, if at all possible. If you can't identify that population reliably, you would test a further 40 claims from the total population and look at any earnings calculations on those. So say those sample sizes are not subject to our judgment or for us to amend. They are prescribed nationally, and that's the approach that we have to follow in doing the work.
Any further questions on item 4 from members? Item 5, the external audit fee letter.
Thank you, Chairman. David has already sort of mentioned the key points within the fee letter. I think what I would say in introducing it for 2018-19, the work that we are required to do hasn't changed, other than, as David mentioned, housing benefit certification is now subject to a separate procurement process and is not under the procurement of PSAA. Going forwards, and there has been a reduction in the fee as a consequence of the PSAA procurement for 2018-19 onwards. Without wanting to overuse the word challenge, I think it is, you know, the way in which the fee has reduced over a number of years presents challenges to auditors, just in terms of becoming more efficient and looking for ways to carry out the work. Using either efficient methodologies or exploring the use of how we use computers or robotics to help us with that. So those are all things that we will be looking at over the coming years. But there are no changes to the deadlines going forward to 18-19, and no changes to the way in which we carry out our audit or the additional powers that we have. So it's here pretty much for your information. Happy to take any comments or questions if there are any, Chairman.
Any questions from members on item 5? Councillor.
So, Chair, there is obviously the obvious one, which is if we're paying you less, are you doing less work?
We still have to do the work that we are required to do to discharge our responsibilities as your auditor. So
Not quite the answer to the question
No.
I was asking.
But no, we have to carry out the same amount of work. We have to be able to do the work that we are required to do under professional standards to deliver your audit opinion. It's not so much what we do as how we do it.
Okay, item 6, Treasury Management Outturn Report.
Yeah, this is a report which is going to the Cabinet and the Council, and it's brought to this committee for scrutiny. It informs the Council and the wider public of the Council's Treasury management activities in 2017-18 and of its Treasury management position at the 31st of March. During the year, we borrowed £1.2 million from Salix to fund LED street lighting, and that was an interest-free loan, Salix being a government-supported body. Our average return on investments was 0.9%, which was down from the previous year because as investments mature, we're not generally able to obtain the rate we'd got previously. At the end of the year, we had £630 million of borrowing and £419 million of investments. I can confirm that we're within our prudential and treasury management indicators, which are shown on Appendix D, and happy to answer any questions.
Questions from members?
Quite a lot, I think, and again, having been absent for a while. I think the first question is simply on page 40. I'm assuming that there's a 9 where there should be a 0 on the maturing after. That's just a housekeeping one. And I refer to Mr. Brown's deputation where he talks about an underspend from the LEP of 33.4 million. Well, if my mathematics correct, we've underspent 50.2 million in capital in the year in question, and if you took out the 33.4 million from the LEP, we've still underspent by 16.8 million. So the same question should presumably apply to the council as applies to the LEP, as to how it is that year on year on year, the council asks you to spend money in order, presumably, to generate income for the council or to reduce costs or whatever it is, and year on year on year, we fail to do it. So that's the first question, if I can just take a number of them. The second is, we talk about structural investments in a way. I mean, we've got structural debt, but we also have structural investments, presumably because we have a reserve of an annual surplus of a certain amount, or even our existing reserves. And I cannot, for the life of me, understand why it is when we live 70 miles away from the city that we put it all into money as opposed to equities or a balanced portfolio of investments that might produce more income for us over a period of time. And I'd love to have an exercise of what would have happened if we put, say, for example, a quarter of our reserves into equities over the last 15 years, and how that would have improved our financial status as an authority, and why it is we don't actually use external people who do understand equities. The next question is the perennial one about MMD. And as I understand it, in the council during the last year, an item was sort of slipped in to say that we are going to be lending 13 odd million pounds to a company with no interest apparently coming back to us, because this is a way of doing something we should have done a long time ago, way back. It's not about regimes, it's about what the council should have done, which is the way it accounted for the money it put into MMD. How has it been accounted? Because it's not in here. Is there a formal debt instrument that exists now between MMD and the council? And what is the expectation of any return? Those things are absolutely vital. And it seems to me, if you're going to send a report to the council, it needs to have things like this that we can see, rather than are just in formats that we can't necessarily tell. It's lots and lots of numbers. So I'd like to see, for example, a schedule of where we've got all our money. I mean, not just in percentages and what. I'd like to see where it is. If it's in Scania Bank, I want to see it, and I don't see why we can't have a schedule. It's not a. I'm assuming it's not confidential information as to where we put our money. If it's in the Halifax or wherever it is, why can't we see it? Why can't we actually look and say, well, if it's in Halifax, why haven't we got something in Hargreaves Lansdowne, or whatever it is? Why are we not being given the information as to where our money is being put, kept, spent, when we need to have it in a liquid form, and how over a period of time we haven't spent it and what we would do with it. Because at the moment, we either get a Treasury Management report, Chairman, that is so opaque that no one can understand it, and I mean, including me, and I think I know a little bit about it, so it's absolutely useless, or it is kind of nebulous and gives us no real information as to what the council is doing with our money and why it isn't doing more sensible things long term and what its strategy is to increase returns on the capital it owns and keeps on our behalf. And I know that's a number of difficult questions. I don't particularly just mean to put it to those hard-working members of the council who are sitting here instead of the person who's responsible for it all. But this is important. This is what the council's money side is supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be scrutinising it, and we can't because we don't have the information in a format that makes it easy for us to do it.
What we'll do is we'll split these between Michael and I. The first question regarding the capital underspend, the reason for the capital underspend was primarily around procurement of investment properties, which we were expecting to procure by 31st of March. We actually incurred £14 million worth of expenditure on, I think it was around about 17th and 18th of March to procure two additional investment properties. So, in fact, that expenditure only slipped by 2 weeks, and the negotiations were well in advance by 31st of March, and it was just a slight timing difference on that.
In that case, a note on this would have helped.
Okay, thank you. That's noted. With regards to maximising investment returns, the whole Treasury management strategy is focused on security of return rather than rate of return. So the policy is designed to optimise rather than maximise return while ensuring maximum security of investment. We do have a small value invested in equities, in trackers, but as I say, to have an amount more than we've invested into trackers would start to tip us towards having a portfolio that didn't ensure return of initial investment rather than maximising the return on that. The do you want to comment on the MMD one, Mike?
Yeah, the loans to MMD aren't in the Treasury management strategy because they went through the capital programme, and the reporting is through the capital programme.
Sorry, but okay, but I remember reading in the very long report to the council, I think just before the election, that we were showing that we were lending money, and it was through the capital programme. But surely, in a sense, if we're lending money as a council, we ought to be looking at a return. If it's a 0% return, at least it needs to be in the system. It's a Treasury management of sorts because it's our money that we are. If we're lending it to a bank, it gets put in the Treasury management report. If we're lending it to a company, for goodness sake, surely we should have it in our Treasury management report as well, even if we have no expectation of return of capital, which rather negates the idea about having it in equities in sort of FTSE 100 companies. But if we're not actually, we're lending the money. How else would you demonstrate it? It's not a capital spend, because if it's a capital spend, it's not it's a spend. We're lending the money. We're lending money to the Halifax or to Scandia Bank. Why is it not in the Treasury report, management report? It is a loan of our money to an institution. Whatever expectation of return of capital or interest, it is a loan.
Well, MMD do pay us interest on the loans, which is above 3%. In terms of where it's reported, the Treasury management function has a strategy and a set of objectives, and the investment in MMD has a different set of objectives.
But we approved those objectives in the full council, and the above commercial rate, is that on the full amount that we've now decided we've lent to MMD, or is it just on a speculative amount? What is the amount that we're saying we have lent to MMD, and what is the amount we're getting back from them every year?
We've currently lent, believe it's around 5 million to MMD, and they are paying interest on all of it.
And that's since when?
MMD have always paid interest on the money we've
When was
lent them.
when was the loan commenced of the 5 million? When did it start and build up?
I believe it started around 2011-12, and there's been loans to MMD of various sizes in most years since then.
Right, so these are loans that are what we call on the balance sheet loans. Is that correct?
Yes, they are on our balance sheet.
So that, for example, would mean cranes and things where we've lent money or we own the cranes and they have to pay. So is that part of the finance, them financing it? Or have we lent the money to them? Have we lent the crane to them? Have we?
We've lent MMD money to fund capital expenditure. In the case of the cranes, they were actually bought by Portsmouth City Council and are leased to MMD.
Okay, so not only have we got £500,000 on deposit in Lloyds, which is getting us 0.8%, we've got £5 million of loans to the company. We've also purchased stuff, so we're lending money to them in a roundabout way by owning something we couldn't possibly use without them using it. And, as I understand it from the EU element and how that's going to resolve, we've also put lots of money into them as well over the last goodness knows how many years that still isn't on our balance sheet. Is that correct?
The loans we've made MMD are on our balance sheet. In the case of the cranes, the asset is on the council's balance sheet. In terms of revenue support, that is not on the council's balance sheet.
Councillor.
Yeah, just to say, in terms of the underspend of the capital programme, I share Councillor Lyon's concerns that it would be helpful to have some information on that, not least in terms of the LEP and why we're not spending that money, because people out there rightly feel that we should be renewing things, we should be renewing our infrastructure. That money clearly will play a crucial role in terms of jobs and everything else. In terms of the information we have on the investment strategy of the council, clearly we get that information. I'm just looking at the minutes under the discussion under Treasury Management Policy. So we do periodically get that information. We get an indication as to where the money's invested, an indication whether it's a long-term, short-term investment. We get information on the ratings for the various institutions where we're investing that money. So I don't think we should give an impression at this meeting that this committee doesn't get that information. It clearly does, and my recollection is it gets a welter of information on all of those things and has the opportunity to ask those questions.
Mason.
A couple of minor questions, the major ones having been asked. Page 34, we find that the Council's cash investment portfolio has decreased by £18 million from 436 to 418. Is this as a result of a strategic decision, or is it something which is a one-off, an accidental decision? What is the purpose of that? That is my first question. My second question concerns Appendix D on page 49, where we see that the housing revenue account, a ratio of financing cost to net revenue stream, the original estimate was 12.6%. The actual is 7.2%. I'd like to know what are the implications of this, presumably this gives us greater flexibility. So is it a deliberate attempt to reduce this ratio?
Right. In answer to the first question, there's a number of reasons why the council has surplus cash, but overall we would want it to decline. In answer to the second question on the HRA ratio of financing cost to net revenue stream, the main major reason why that's occurred is through the decision for the housing revenue account not to provide for the repayment of its debt for a 3-year period, during which, under government guidelines, it's required to reduce its rents by 1% a year.
In both of these cases, Chairman, I think it would have been useful to have a note explaining what is otherwise, for ordinary members of this committee, quite an opaque line. So could I, on the Council's cash investment portfolio, you have said it is the intention to reduce this. Can you explain to us why it is your intention to reduce this, and would this increase any form of risk?
And when I say the intention is to reduce it, we are currently over-borrowed and we want to move out of that position. And that will involve a reduction in the council's cash balances, although that's not the only reason why the council has cash balances. I mean, another major reason is the earmarked reserves on the council's balance sheet, which are all cash backed. In terms of risk, there is always a liquidity risk, but in our current position, I don't think liquidity is really an issue for us.
Through you, Chair, could I just also clarify that the main driver that's driving the reduction in the council's cash balances is expenditure on the council's capital programme. Michael has explained that the opportunities were right to borrow money in advance of need because interest rates were so low. That money was taken to fund future expenditure in the capital programme. So at the moment we've got high cash balances because we've taken borrowing in advance of need, but as we incur expenditure against our planned and approved capital programme, so of course those cash balances will reduce.
So basically you're saying it is better to have it in things than in cash.
Yes, that would be correct, especially with the current low interest rates.
Any further questions from members on agenda item 6?
Just to follow up to that, and the question is there actually a strategy and a timescale for having borrowed before everyone thought the interest rates were going to go up, which of course presumably we think they're still going to do that. In order, what you're telling us, we're holding cash that costs us say 2%. We're getting 1.2% for the sake of argument in the markets. So we're making a net loss of 0.8% on that money for the time being, presumably while we're waiting for something to spend it on. Is there actually is there a purpose to how much we borrowed, or is it simply say, let's get £600 million worth of money out of the PW or whatever it is, and then hold on to it and just spend it as and when? Or was there a plan for how much money was needed for whatever particular projects were on the drawing board, which may or may not still be on the drawing board, considering there's a new administration in upstairs. So given that that's the case, we've borrowed money at a low interest rate, admittedly. We're receiving less on return than we're actually paying for it. we have a new administration who might decide that they don't want to spend this money in the way that the old administration were wanting to. So what happens then?
And our borrowing decisions are guided by the capital programme, and we may borrow a few years in advance if we deem it's an opportune time to borrow. In terms of where we are at the moment, the extent of our over-borrowing is falling, and we would hope that it will be somewhere close to zero at the end of this financial year, although that is dependent on the capital programme being spent.
If that's all questions from members, before we move on, can we also ask then that alongside the recommendation that it be noted, can we add a note that we would request further information on the points that's been highlighted to be included before the report goes forward? Because I think for members outside this committee, so we don't have to reiterate the same explanations, it would be helpful.
Yes, certainly.
Thank you. Item 7, Annual Audit Plan Report and Audit Plan 2018-19.
Thank you, Chair. Could I bring to your attention a couple of amendments? It's actually not our annual plan, i.e. that it doesn't contain the annual audit opinion. That will be coming to you in July. This is our progress report for 17-18 work, along with the audit plan for 18-19. So we bring to your attention whether we're on progress to complete all of the works. You will see that we are on track. We have a few reports that are left in draft. I envisage that these will be issued as final come the annual opinion, which will be for July. We're bringing to your attention 4 new areas where no assurance has been given. 1 relates to IT and procurement, 2 relate to MMD, and 1 relates to a school where we undertook a full review. You will also note that we have practically completed all of the work that we undertake for our external clients, and that we have the audit plan for 2018-19 which is attached, which needs to be approved by this committee. I wasn't going to go into any other area in particular depth. I am happy to take any and all questions that are raised.
Members, questions? Councillor Barrett.
Thanks, Chair. Just in terms of Mr. Brown in his deputation spoke about the IT procurement inventory and disposal item, and I, having read that, share his sense of astonishment, not least in terms of the critical exception there, that PCC does not have a contract in place with a company that disposes of PCC's old hard disk drives, resulting in no contractual regulations regarding data protection. I mean, in the last few months, it's been hammered into us in terms of council officers and councillors, and indeed in our, I would expect in our individual workplaces as well, the importance of data protection, not least for the new regulations. And then when you see something like this that is frightening, I mean, in terms of your own hard drives, I'm sure everyone with their own computers is very wary when they're disposing of their computer equipment in terms of any financial and personal information that they might have. And I think all mine are probably...
Perhaps I can make comments on the points, if that's okay, and then Councillor Ferret, and go through them.
In terms of what?
In terms of, so that you can see that we're in contract now and the actions that have been taken.
Okay, well, I was only going to follow it up by saying there's also there about policies and procedures which are out of date. So I had a question there about how how long, how much out of date they are, and clearly the overarching question of why this has been allowed to happen.
So what I would propose is that I go through those 7 points and give you an update as to where we are actually with those now, noting as well that this will actually be re-audited again this year.
Okay.
I was going to say, it'd be useful to hear a response from the internal audit team first.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. We have actually ascertained IT provided to us yesterday a position update, which I'm assuming is what Greg would like to go through at some stage. We haven't verified to date that position. We will. We are duty bound, going back to Mr. Brown's comments, and I will factor in some dates so that there is some clarity. We're duty bound if there's a critical exception that we will follow up within 3 months. And all of the other audit areas we will also follow up. I've already had an initial discussion because there's a couple of areas I think won't perhaps be implemented straight away. So we will probably do 2 types of reviews. They have moved quite quickly to address the issues, and there is now a contract in place. As at the 6th is the information that I was given. As I said, we will need to verify this independently. And they have undertaken a number of other steps as well to make sure that things are in place. In relation to the missing items, the figure is now down to 3,900. However, we need to verify the whole amount that was still unaccounted for. We will do that in conjunction with IT and bring that back to you. So the next time we will report, we'll give a position update on the critical that we have in place. Beyond that, if there's anything in addition that Greg feels he'd like to add, then I'll hand over to him.
I would like to just quickly hit 2 or 3 bullet points on each of those 7, and hopefully that might answer perhaps Councillor Lyons' queries and then answer any queries at the end, if people are happy with that. Okay, so the point is that we are in contract now. There was a contract previously with a company called XMA who provide the hardware, but that contract was varied when it was relet. During that process, the contract with Jadestone was missed by an oversight by the commercial team. That has been picked up with now, and indeed the commercial team governance, the commercial team training, and actually the people in the commercial team have changed. So we now have a weekly meeting, which is documented and minuted, and in that we review the supply chain for the IT department and the entire council's IT provisions to make sure that all contracts are in place.
So, Chairman, can I interrupt? Sorry, you are unfortunately helped or hindered by the fact you have the last 3 chairmen of the GNS sitting beside you, helping you away. I suspect so. But it would be very useful if Greg could just refer to which item he's talking about on each case. We've got the pages 46 and 47, I think, of our...
Oh, I'm going through what I've got down as point 6.
Point 6, point 1, point 2.
Page 46, yeah.
Yeah, so if you could say that the exception you're talking, which exception you're talking about. So one says exception 1, exception 2.
Yeah, so what I was doing, Councillor Lyons, was just providing a brief overview. I've got 2 more points and then I'll go through each point, yeah? The second point is that the ITSM service management delivery system was 15 years old. We identified this over a year ago. We've been out to market, we've sourced it, we've gone through configuration, we've gone through UAT, and that's going out, that's been implemented in July. That itself has a much more modern supply chain asset register function within it, which will mean that we'll move from being predominantly paper-based to being proper traceability from the point it's received and it goods in to the point it's actually disposed of. And then the last thing is the policy. The policy was last updated with the Windows 7 upgrade some years ago. The policy has actually now been updated by my operations manager. I've got a copy to review. In addition to that, what we've also done in the IT service to strengthen things up is key policies are now being put on Policy Hub so that we can audit that people have actually gone through it and read them. And once that's finally approved, it will be going on to Policy Hub. So in relation to point 1, I think we have covered that off by the fact that we are now in contract. and the points I mentioned during the introduction. In relation to point 2, as again I just talked about, the policy is being revised. It's going to go on to Policy Hub as well. In relation to point 3, again, we're revising the policy, but we're also making sure that people are aware of that policy, and we're also tracking that that policy is being read. In addition to that, there's the new ITSM. In the audit report, indeed, in front, it talks about workflows. What that means is that there will be, every time, for example, someone interacts with the IT service desk, they will be asked to reconfirm what assets, what equipment they have, because one of the issues that we have is that equipment can get passed around once it's in the services. So everybody who rings up will be asked to confirm the asset ID numbers, etc. So that will make the list a lot more accurate and up to date. Which is one of the points.
Why can't it be automatically updated? Because the person dealing with it at the service desk, considering they only got 541 incidents over a month, and there are about 30 of them, which amazes me in terms of the number of people, why can they not just get onto that machine remotely and get the information straight into their own machines, instead of asking somebody what it says on the back of it?
So when the new ITSM is rolled out in July, that process will happen. Then
This has been going on for 20 years in the industry. For 2 years, we've been looking at IT, which we identified as being probably the worst functioning part of this council, and it is still awful in terms of you've got high risks here, you've got massive expenditure, you've got all the mistakes that are occurring in the reports going right to the end of this, and 2 years of procurement has done nothing ultimately to solve this problem, which is we're spending far too much on it, we're not getting good enough return, there are all sorts of problems, we can't get rid of data which we need to for GDPR, all sorts of stuff. The IT department of this council is simply not fit for purpose.
If I respond to that and bring it back to the actual audit, the point is that with the new ITSM being rolled out, the actual asset identities in there will be actually fully correct, and then moving forward they'll be regularly checked every time someone brings their equipment in, or they have a reason to contact it. In terms of the exception risk number 4, we are not looking to make a permanent impact on any of the harbour in terms of embedding a name into it, because that will mean that will affect the resale value. What we are doing is making sure that all the points I talked about before in terms of making sure that the asset management is up to date using a modern ITSM, the one which is coming in July, that's not 15 years old. Plus, we're also looking at, previously, I'm led to understand, we'd looked at the use of RIFIDs, but they'd not been followed through because of cost. Well, we're looking at that. We're also looking at the use of QRs. And we've also got going through the governance process at the moment to bring in proper kind of barcoding, so that every time something is touched or goes through the supply chain, it's scanned. That, for example, the stock that was identified as potentially lost was actually down to the fact that paper records hadn't been updated by technicians touching the stock. With the barcode scan, and it's hoped to drive that right down. In addition to that, the last point would be on exception 7. The warehouse itself has been completely relayed. All the shelving now has modern bin referencing numbers. Those bin referencing numbers are going to be put into the new ITSM asset management. That's being so that relay has actually happened. The new ITSM goes in July. The stock count of each bin is actually happening now, so that will be uploaded into the ITSM. As Lizzie just mentioned, the value came down to just under 4,000, which as a percentage of the overall stock that went through that is a shrinkage figure of less than 3%. If you look at shrinkage figures in any warehouse, you do have a shrinkage figure of around 2 to 3%. But the point I'm trying to get across is we are taking a hell of a lot of actions.
Sorry, okay, I accept that, and I don't want to be angry with the way things are done in terms of policy, but actually it's execution that matters to me. The first is, you're saying if it's 3%, then you're telling us that the IT stock is worth about £1 million. presumably.
That will circulate through during the year, yeah.
Well, I mean, you know, that's so we're spending £5.7 million on help and support and licensing in this authority, and £1 million on equipment. We're getting really, understandably, we're focusing on the equipment itself. There are plenty of things one can do that are slightly more, slightly newer and more interesting in terms of holding on to your stock, but it also means you know where your employees are, which would be quite difficult, I'd imagine, for some people in this council. But it would be quite a sensible thing to do. But actually, it's the £5.7 million spend that I'm more worried about than the £1 million on computer things, because actually it's still far too high.
Before you answer the question, I can talk about it.
Greg, before you I just want to finish the point, which is simply that we're fiddling like while rain burns here. And yes, it's important to have these procurement processes and things, but actually they are delaying, in my opinion, the implementation of an executable policy, which is to make IT more efficient and far, far cheaper than it currently is.
So in answering the question of more efficient and far, far cheaper, one of the things that we've been spending a huge amount of time to do is actually to increase our architecture practice within the team in terms of understanding how it works, the new modern IT stacks that are actually there in the industry, looking at our actual policy in terms of whether we are purely working on a hosted model, a hybrid model, or going into the cloud. And then, as you know, with your IT background, once we've established that and we've actually got the IT architecture plans in place, you then go through the phase to get to that kind of cloud first, taking into account total cost of ownership. That's the reason why we'll be hybrid. And then we have to go through those plans. So we have already tested, for example, Azure. We're actually just moving the Exchange into the Azure. And then a lot of these modern IT solutions that you talk about will be in a position to bring those on board. We've done a presentation to the exec, taken them through that. Quite happy to take you through that presentation.
So how many consultants have you used externally who actually know?
Okay, I'm going to probably move on from this a little bit because it's straying from the audit actions that have identified into performance of the IT function, which I think is a little bit outside the remit of what we're discussing here today.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I don't come from an IT background, and this is my first time on this committee, so I'm sitting and listening with interest. However, I do come from a police background, and one of the things that concerns me most is missing equipment. The percentages of what you couldn't find and what you still can't find, even low IT appear to have done some work in trying to track some of it down, are still quite staggering numbers. What I'm not clear about is, has all this equipment gone missing in the last 12 months, or is this an accumulated figure over how long a period? Presumably under item 7 you'll be going back to check that they've actually found £12,000 worth of equipment that wasn't there when you first looked. And have you come to any conclusions about where this equipment may or may not have gone? Has it been just lost, chucked out by mistake, misappropriated by staff? What conclusions have you come to?
Thank you, Councillor Malcolm. We can't give you any assurances. The only thing that we can tell you is that the records and the overall system in this particular area was so poor, we can't refute or substantiate either way. We will, when we come to do the follow-up, actually seek the evidence that if assets have been located, we will have sight of those particular assets. The 20,000, from recollection, it was a recent purchase. So there were a number of items that were purchased at a particular time. I'll get confirmation for you and I can come back. Sometimes when you have a system and you have multiple failings, particularly perhaps around some of the records here, that's where we're unable to. So I don't want to cast aspersions that we have anybody willfully stealing, but I have to be honest, we can't say either way.
I can perhaps answer the question, Ken, in terms of how that figure's come down. The vast majority of it is due to the housekeeping of the desktop technicians after they've looked at and used stock. Once that's been brought up to date, that's brought that figure down. And then there was a figure of £5,500 worth of stock of these products called iron keys, which are essentially portable memory devices. They were actually mislaid in the warehouse, never left the warehouse, and as part of that exercise I talked about earlier on in terms of relaying all of the bins, they actually then found it. So that just highlights the
Thank you.
where we were at.
First of all, in a public meeting, I prefer to be called by my title. Thank you. It is being live streamed. Secondly, obviously, that gives me even more concern that brand new equipment in a warehouse disappears and has difficulty in tracking it. Just confirm from internal audit, the question I asked originally was, do you know over what period this has gone missing? But I anticipate from what you're saying, because of the record issue, you can't say that over what period stuff disappeared. Is that correct?
I will confirm, but it was my recollection that this was a recent purchase, so we're talking about in the last few years, but I'll confirm and let you know over what period.
Councillor Bosher.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Coming back to the critical exception, Lizzie, it would come across to me that we've been happily continuing to dispose of old hard disks through this particular company with an expired contract on the back of it. How long ago did that contract actually expire before it was discovered?
Do you have any other questions? Because we can look while we answer those.
It sort of leads into others, but yes, it would be useful. But am I right in the assumption that we were carrying on using this company after we had an expired contract?
As I understand it, we had a contract with XMA who used Jadestone for the disposal. When the contract with XMA was, correct me if I'm wrong,
That's the company, is it?
XMA was the overall contractor who then used Jadestone, a separate company, for the disposals. When XMA's contract
we were happy to allow that company to subcontract that, were we?
As far as I'm aware, yes.
Bearing in mind this is being live streamed. So that's a yes then. We were happy with that arrangement.
The organisation was, yes.
Right. Okay.
So then when the XMA contract was altered, was it altered?
Yes, so that would have been called off of government, central government framework G-Cloud. Yeah, so then whilst they've done that procurement, what's not happened is people haven't checked to see that the scope has changed.
So then Jadestone will continue to be used outside of that contract.
So a framework changed, they continued to do what they were doing, which in fact became a breach then, did it?
In effect, they were using Jadestone without a contract.
So we're talking IT now. I can hold my mobile phone up the right way, but I'm not quite as adept as some of the rest of you. Well, why are you finding out about when this contract expired? Because clearly it says did not have a contract in place. As I recollect, going back a bit, we actually had a procurement system that was sold to all of us in lots of presentations and whatever about how we could track contracts and we could source through different suppliers and everything else like that. It would flag up when contracts were close to expiry, etc., etc., etc. Why didn't that system flag up this? Because it's a contract, isn't it?
Absolutely. So at the start of the point, I raised the point to the work that we've been doing with the category team there. We've had a change in personnel that were managing that team, and what we've also done is brought into the weekly meetings, which again are audited and minuted. I can bring those minutes to GNA, and one of the key agenda items is where we have been for about the last 6 months since I've been running those meetings, making sure that we check on a weekly basis the contract pipeline.
Because this has got to be going back a good couple of years to the best of my knowledge that we actually had these sorts of things. And also, sorry, Chairman, I'm hogging it a bit. We also had a report that used to come to G&A. I haven't sat on the committee for a period of time now, so I don't know, which used to show contract exceptions where we hadn't, the city solicitor is nodding, so I am right in what I'm saying, which used to highlight things such as where we hadn't gone out to a number of different ones, if we hadn't done it appropriately in that respect, perhaps so something's overrun. And it also highlighted the exceptions which were, in my opinion, legitimate. If we had to get perhaps fallen trees after a hurricane, we had to get people straight in the next, to deal with it. We sort of like bypassed it, but it was shown up as a contract exception because of the nature of what it was. Was this ever shown up as a contract exception?
There are two. It goes back to what we said at the start there, which was that this was in a contract that then got varied. So it then became, if you like, a new service to need to procure. What we identified was that didn't have a contract in place, which is what we've now put in. But because the way it was in a contract and then came out of scope, it didn't get picked up.
So it should have gone on such a report, but we don't know.
We don't have one.
So such a thing may not have been picked up and referred to the gas committee if it hadn't gone through internal audit. Okay.
Sorry, just quickly, can I clarify then? Is that a report that still exists and we will still get to receive on contract exceptions?
We get that.
Okay.
You will get it, just not in this cycle.
Right. And perhaps my last question, this is obviously a breach of data protection rules in what we've done. Government dish out sodding big fines for breach of data protection. Are we at risk of some mega fine from government, the appropriate government organisation, for the fact that we've actually breached data protection by doing what we've done?
I'd have to find out the detail of how we actually assessed this particular breach, because it was the way the cycle of the reporting goes. This was many months ago that we would have considered it, and I'll report that back to members. I anticipate that we reached the conclusion at that stage that the risk of the data actually being revealed was quite low. A lot of these files, which hard drives...
Well, it should be zero, shouldn't it? Not risk should
not
be zero.
Not always, and when I get the data exception report, I'll explain why. Upon occasions there are data breaches which are non-reportable data breaches. A lot of these files here would have been upon encrypted disks. That wouldn't be a concern at all from the point of view of data protection. Others would have been on disks which weren't encrypted because they were older disks. All of our disks now would be encrypted. I'll have to get the details. I don't have that, and I will provide that to members.
Okay. Have you found the information yet, Lizzie?
Yeah, the contract for XMA was February 2016, so that would be when the disposals wasn't picked up, so it would be from that date.
So we're talking 2 years. 2 years.
That's when the XMA contract started, according to the contracts register.
Started.
Well, was variation. Yeah.
So this critical exception that's listed here has actually been bumbling along for 2 years. Then is that what we're saying here?
That would be what the
Yeah.
The level of encryption on PCC's machines is very high. So the likelihood of a data breach is reduced because of it.
There's two issues here that I can see, being simplistic about it, Lizzie. On the one hand, there's the potential for the data breach that we're talking about. On the other hand, we've actually got a contract that has put us in this position that, on what we've just been hearing, hasn't been reviewed or looked at for best part of 2 years, when we've got a lot of procurement processes, and I've alluded to the systems that we've been preached to about on a regular basis about how we actually go through this. We've got something here that has been sat there for 2 years and hasn't actually been addressed by procurement or been picked up, which I think is... I don't know where else we can actually take something like this, because what we're hearing, with respect, Chairman, is a lot of, we'll come back to the next meeting and talk to you about it. Well, the next meeting's July, which is probably going to be a lot to do with the accounts and the audit bit. So in reality, this is going to be something that's going to come back in the autumn time to say, yeah, we've managed to sort it. And I don't think that is an acceptable position to actually be in.
Can I just ask for one point of almost technical clarity? My understanding is the contract is the failure, and that's the technical breach in the sense that we don't have a contract in place. But to the best of our knowledge, we believe these hard drives were adequately disposed of, and therefore the data that was on them was disposed of. Or can we not confirm that either?
From what we saw, Jadestone do have the accreditation needed for the disposal of hard drives. Yes.
Can I also add that if any disk is encrypted, it is not a matter of concern. So this is a matter of process, and we're saying the proper process wasn't in place. The ICO's advice is, and always is, and you'll see from the notes which we've got on data breaches later as well, that where we lose any equipment, whether it's a hard drive or memory stick, laptop, which is encrypted, that is not a concern with regard to data breach, because the encryption which we use means that it is sufficiently secure as far as the ICO is concerned. So I think here we don't have a major problem around the data breach. What is of concern is that we don't actually have proper contracts, or we didn't have a proper contract in place, and that's the failing, I think, which is being reported to you.
Chairman, the thing that I understand Councillor Bosch's concerns and everybody else's, but it seems to me we have 100 people working in the department upstairs. Why can't they wipe the discs before they're collected? Yeah. It seems to me ridiculous that we're asking an external company to pick the things up and then wipe them. We should do them ourselves. It's not difficult. It's easy to do technologically. It costs pretty little to have the means of doing it. Why don't we do it ourselves and then get them collected and disposed of or sold or whatever happens?
Chairman, I think we're really getting into the detail of the functioning of the IT service. Bear in mind what members have said. We'll look at that.
Councillor Ferret, I think you get a point on that.
I think in part Michael has answered the question about, because I was going to ask a question about the Information Commissioner, but clearly the report says that we cannot confirm that it's only encrypted drives that have been collected. I'm just wondering how long it goes back in terms of encryption, and how long have we been encrypting and to what level. But if we can't be certain, if there is information that has gone to the company and it's not encrypted, then isn't that a matter for the Information Commissioner?
I think what we're being told today, and forgive me, I haven't got a clear recollection of this, but we did consider it at the time, is that there isn't a problem with the company and how they would have disposed of the discs. We're confident that any discs that we sent to them would have been properly disposed of, and there isn't a risk around those. Secondly, your question about encryption, it is many, many years now that the Council has been encrypting all of its discs. I certainly think it's 68 years going back now that we've been encrypting everything. Having said that, of course, the hardware we'd be disposing of... Yeah. So, no. I shall enunciate more clearly. Some of the discs we would be disposing of would be older than that, because we do use equipment. Well, we have been getting rid of and disposing of equipment that's older. But the problem really isn't so much of there being a potential data breach, because we do know that the company which is being used and the subcontractors being used are absolutely excellent at this particular part of their business. So we don't have concern in that particular area. So I think it's probably maybe slightly overstated in the report. It is something which they would have raised, and then our data protection officer and myself would have considered it. And I'll certainly do a note back to members, because I don't have the detail on precisely what we did, and that doesn't need to wait for your next meeting. I will make sure you get that in the next couple of weeks, if not sooner.
Councillor Mason.
Thank you, Chairman. I would like to bring us on to page 48 and 49, which brings us to MMD. In exception 1, we note it was not possible to establish details relating to the quote or the tendering process. It was also not possible to obtain documentation to show at what level staff could seek quotes. Under exception 2, we find that in at least one case, £420,000 was spent without a contract, and you cannot locate the contracts for £2.3 million worth of expenditure, and you have no idea where they are. In any other situation, this would raise questions about the integrity of the company. I am concerned that we are absolutely sure that the company is operating with integrity and in a proper manner. So what actions have you taken to ensure that it has operated in a manner, given that you have not been able to establish certain of these details? The corollary to this is that you have seen agreed actions coming into place. It appears it's just drawn up, the comprehensive procurement policy is just drawn up by the financial controller. Will this be open? How far will this be opaque? How far will there be areas which you cannot investigate and cannot report back to this committee?
Thank you, Councillor. This is another example of when the underlying systems, there is a total lack of the documentation to support the work that is being undertaken. There has been a change in management from the financial controller's perspective. The new individual that has been in place for a little while, but certainly not for the whole period that we've been auditing, has already implemented a number of actions. We are going to assist with them in that we are going to use our data analytics software tool to be able to give them elements of management information, which we then hope will enable them to draw up a plan with what they need to put in place and the priority for actually undertaking that. I can't give you assurance again as to whether they've been operating effectively. We can only comment on the areas to which we have undertaken reviews. There has been quite a cultural change within MMD, certainly over the last year. There has been a change, obviously, with the port director and a new operations manager at MMD. They've had a number of issues, procurement being one of them. The area of our activities for MMD is quite light, but last month we've had an agreement to extend so that we can assist them and so that there can be greater transparency as well with where they have areas that they need to address and where the priorities are.
If I can come back on two of those. Do you see there to be any risk from the former lax processes that we are in danger of civil action in any area? And the second one is that, okay, there will be transparency. Transparent to whom? Who will have sight of this?
The transparency should be we will have greater input with the work that we undertake because we will undertake more audits for MMD. All of those will be reported back here. There will also be greater transparency as well for the board at MMD, to which there has been a change, I think, in the last year with membership with who now sits on the board. I know that there is one council member who currently sits on the board. I believe there may be discussions for a second to sit on the board. So again, the information that will be presented to them, they've already enhanced a lot of their reporting matrices to which go to that board in any rate. In relation to the civil action, there is no indication. But again, I couldn't give you commitment one way or the other.
So there is a level of risk?
There is, the nature of the beast would be that there would be a level of risk associated, yes.
Sorry, just to pick up on Councillor Mason's point there, I was looking at the audit plan you submitted as part of this as well, and obviously there is a number under MMD, health and safety, gift and hospitality, GDPR, budget monitoring, commercial contract, payroll, etc., that are planned for 2018. Picking up on what we've just discussed, my concern would be actually that there isn't one targeting the wider point of culture and governance. coming from a commercial background myself, the findings and exceptions in themselves are of concern, but what is more of concern to me is that for those to have occurred suggests a much wider failing in culture and governance within an organisation. And I wonder whether there is scope to ensure that the further audit work you do starts by an overarching look at the culture and governance within that business.
I'm aware because I was present, so I hope I'm not crossing any boundaries with sharing, but the board members themselves are looking to get an independent assessment on the governance arrangements. I don't know how that has progressed. If that is something that they're not progressing, we will factor it in on our side of the equation.
I was looking at Michael then to say, presumably given that we own the company, we can direct that we want an independent audit of that area.
Well, it's an interesting situation because, of course, it's an arm's length company, but we have very persuasive powers in relation to it, yes.
So to that end, does MMD not have external auditors that actually go in and look at all of these things, and why didn't they pick them up? Because clearly, I don't know how many days you spent doing it, which comes to a question actually about your internal audit, but clearly you found it. Why didn't they?
They do have external auditors. I believe they are Fernanda and Tovel. Maybe mispronouncing. I think it's Tovan. I will get confirmation, but I believe external audit will be looking at the finances of the company. So their focus will be a different focus to internal audit. I can't answer as to why they did or did not. I don't believe they would they certainly wouldn't look at the same areas that we would look at, and only they can probably answer the question as to why it hadn't been identified before. I'm due to have a conversation with them so that we don't have any crossover in activities and so that we have clarity and greater understanding as to what we are covering and if there's any potential gaps. The level of coverage that we've had agreed in previous years was that we would commit 30 days and 30 days only because they actually pay us for that piece of work, but obviously that is increased for this year. So the audits that you have in front of you, and that's not all of them, would have been 30 days worth of our work.
So that means that in an ordinary audit, you'd probably get about a week, maybe 2 weeks of somebody sitting there for that size company. But having had an example of sampling for the housing benefit, it does seem quite strange that if they actually conducted an audit rather than doing the accounts, which is a different thing. So are they auditors? Are they doing an audit, or are they actually just preparing the accounts for the company? And that's an important question. I don't know whether you know the answer to that, but it seems to me if they don't audit it, we need to make sure that that company is audited every year without fail. And whatever it would cost a bit more, but it absolutely is vital it's audited and not just accounted for. But if they had done a sampling, it seems to me they would have been unlikely that they'd have missed, to be quite frank, given the lack of systems there. It's unlikely they'd have missed the points that or at least a few of them that you've raised. I wanted to, sorry, actually going back to your internal audit, there are another two more questions. The first is 4.3, page 44. You very helpfully tell us that the 2018-19 internal audit is contracted to conduct 1,005 days of audit work for external clients while also providing a chief internal auditor for 2 other local authorities and the Solent Local Enterprise Partnership, which I imagine means that you're very busy. Are you allocating or being allocated or receiving extra resources compared, for example, to 2 years ago when you weren't having to do these extra things? And if not, why not? And does that actually mean if you weren't, that we didn't actually need to pay as much as we were paying 2 years ago for our internal audit?
In answer to your first question regarding are they auditing it or are they preparing the accounts, they're auditing the accounts. And in answer to do we have extra resources? Yes, there was an agreement last year. The extra authorities that we've taken on is the Isle of Wight, as Chief Internal Auditor, and Southampton. We undertake a significant amount of work as well for Southampton, and we had a look at the resourcing that we had in place. This was effective from April of last year. We also agreed as well to undertake the bulk of the audit work as well for Farnborough Council, but not Chief Internal Auditor. We have sufficient resources. There is an increase, but we are very cost effective, Councillor Lyon.
Well, I'm sure you are, Lizzie. But my question, though, is quite simple. Is it a linear increase? So you've increased the number of resources available to you in terms of man hours, working hours, probably sort of for politically correct purposes. So you've increased the working hours alongside the amount of work that you've increased, or that that Portsmouth City's internal audit department has taken on. Is it absolutely? Is it proportional, exact, or is it perhaps even more efficient than it was before?
Well, it is more efficient than it was before because we had agreement by the director, by Michael, and by Section 151 officer to invest in data analytics software, which has enabled us to streamline some of our testing. So there is an efficiency. Plus, we have revamped how we go about doing some of our audits and enabling us to work sometimes off-site and not obviously have a number of other bits and pieces that are factored in. For the percentage of additional days that we now cover, we pro rata have less people than had we just stuck to the original provisions that we had in place. So there is definitely more around the efficiency than there is around, so it's not like for like.
Chairman, one thing I could emphasise really is a consequence of having a larger audit service. Of course, the other local authorities get the benefit of that as well, because we do believe we provide a good service. But we get the benefit because we have a larger, more highly skilled team of people. Increased specialisms are available to PCC whenever areas of concern arise, which we want to look at. So this is really quite beneficial to the council. There is a substantial income which is produced, and I think it is really quite a good thing. Quite happy to go through the details with any councillor if they've got any particular concerns.
Well, I didn't have a concern. I was just raising the question because it seemed sensible to mention, since you didn't actually put it in there, saying, well, you haven't. The final question about your next year's scope. Of course, as you know, I have IT is my bugbear here. And there's only one that I can see that you've got down, which is looking at emails and stuff, IT security, email backups, etc. We know that the GDPR issue for us as an authority is difficult because of our legacy systems. But we don't know how difficult it is, and we don't know whether or not the kind of efforts that are being made to do something about it are, first of all, enough, second, right, and third, will protect us from the kind of enormous fines that Councillor Bosher was hanging over us like the sword of Damocles earlier. Could we possibly have that as one of your projects for next year? Because it's absolutely vital that we know. Because at the moment, if we just sweep it under the carpet, we'll just say we didn't know about it. But we do. We have some understanding that it could be pretty serious, and let's get out in the open sorted.
In response to Mr. Brown's deputation as well, where he mentioned the energy company is included in this plan. In relation to GDPR, we have an audit report in draft at present, and I will hand you over because I think we have a position update to be able to give.
So we have a audit report relating to data archiving, which goes back a few years, and that covers the number of systems we have that are GDPR compliant and aren't compliant, and that is going out in draft in the coming days. So that will be ready for the next meeting.
A preview?
Can I suggest we don't get a preview as well, because we need to make sure it's correctly when it's presented to you, accurate.
Councillor Elcombe.
Thank you, Chairman. I was looking at Appendix A1 from your other list of breaches, whether they be critical or high. And I know from the report you've obviously picked out IT, MMD and St George's beneficial, but there are other groups within your list that have fairly high risks. Mayfield, for external, 10 high risks. I note in the action have been agreed, and I presume you'll go back and check those, but would it be worth knowing what some of those are? Because obviously with St George's as another school, you spout out all the issues that they've got. Are we to believe that the same issues have arisen with Mayfield? Because I note in the text relating to weakness in operational controls for income, petty cash, purchase cards, inventory, PTA funds and no CCTV policy. That's quite a wide-ranging list of failures, but you haven't highlighted those in the report. So I just wondered why you picked out one school and not another one that seemed to have equally bad management. And again, we've got another one with youth centres where there's 6 high-risk items. Again, cash handling, which is always a worry, cash handling policy, etc., is within their remit. And again, it says actions have been agreed. It would perhaps be nice to know what some of those actions are.
Councillor Elcombe, apologies, because we've used the same reporting format that we've had in place for a year or so, and Appendix A1 are areas that have been previously reported where we highlight it to you to keep as a watching brief. So they would have already historically have come along to the committee. I think one of the things that we need to ascertain from you, bearing in mind, I know we've had various members that have been on previous committees, but we need to re-establish with you whether you are happy with the level of information that's coming through and in what format you'd like that to be presented. So Appendix 1A is historic because it's the watching brief, which is, so it would have been in the body of the main reports for previous ones. But perhaps we can revisit post-July, because I think July may be a heavy meeting for you.
Chairman, if I may, I think I'm the only one on the committee who's not served on it before, so maybe if I come and see you at some point after July for a one-to-one.
Chairman, it raises a good point, because actually it would be sensible, as I think I've asked in the past, that we actually have the date in the audits, in that PCC 1718, whatever it is, the date that audit happened, because that would actually help. We'd know then whether we're in quarter or out of it.
Councillor Bosher.
I think it might be my standing deputy next time, John. You don't have one, do you? No. The point that you made there, Lizzie, about Appendix A1 was that these were historical ones, i.e. they'd come up. So the fact that Councillor Elcombe made a reference to Mayfield, that may well have been a critical exception that was highlighted in a report to a previous committee. The only point I'd make is the top one, the top 2 on that historical report are actually 2 contained in the body of this report. Yeah. So there appears to be a mix. If you are going to do that, and I understand why you're doing this Appendix A as a means to update people on what has happened about previous ones that were reported and clearly discussed, could you put a break in there at the very least so we know between historical and ones? I'm not asking for a separate report, but you could separate the boxes for the top 2 to the rest of the body if those are the ones that they are. So that it's, sorry?
Top 4 are in the report, and the next one's not.
Well, top 4, 5, 10, 20, break them so that ones that are featuring in the current report are perhaps broken, and the ones that are perhaps an update on something previous are shown on within the same format, but a little bit broken down, I suppose.
Councillor Mason.
Page 57, the audits completed since last meeting. What was the bottom of the list? You have community and communication, covert surveillance, social media. 2 high-risk exceptions were raised in relation to corporate direction, oversight and regulation. I'd like and you only have limited assurance. So could you explain a little more about what was wrong here, what the problems were, and what actions are being taken to rectify those problems?
Unusually, Councillor Mason, this is an area that Audit has inherited to action. The use of social media from a surveillance perspective has come on the table from the Office of the Surveillance Commissioner, who inspect us on a regular basis, and this is in relation to whether we enact or use the Regulatory Investigative Powers Act and requirements if we want to do anything covert. We're very good on the RIPA side, in that we have not used RIPA for a considerable number of years because there are a number of other actions that we can take. But what emerged was that the use of social media to perhaps view whether somebody was fraudulently claiming benefits or whether they had the means to repay a debt was less transparent. So we undertook an exercise where we asked all of the directors to confirm whether any members of staff were using social media, so i.e. whether they were using Facebook, whether they were using LinkedIn. Now, from the Office of the Surveillance Commissioner's perspective, and the legal framework that sits around this, is just because if you have Facebook and it is open, there is an expectation that you are communicating with a select group. So it is in effect to be treated as private, which means if we go and look up Councillor Lyon's Facebook account to see what he's been up to, if we looked that up once, that may be fine because we had perhaps a particular concern. But if we looked it up 2 or 3 times, then we're starting to stray into we are snooping on Councillor Lyon, and that should require a request for a RIPA application, to which we have a couple of authorising officers. I happen to be one of the authorising officers, and Michael is the senior responsible officer for RIPA. Well, it's not Michael's fault, yeah. Once we undertook the audit and it was identified that there was a lack of awareness that the use of doing this may trigger covert surveillance, it was deemed, between Michael and I think we agreed that Audit was probably best placed, being an authorising officer, that we would put in place a number of controls, i.e. educating staff, so communications kind of going out to say you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do this haphazardly without there being bona fide reasons behind it, and when you do it, you need to record how you're doing it so that it can be monitored. So in effect it was the lack of training and there was a lack of a documented process. Now there's very small areas within the authority that do use this, and they have been using it really quite innocently to try and establish and gather intelligence, not being totally mindful that obviously there is a potential issue. So we had no particular cases where we thought anybody had breached because they had been recording when they were using it, but it is an area that we need to tighten up on, specifically because A, we have a duty to abide by the law, and B, because we are likely to be inspected at some stage in the near future, and the last time we were inspected was in 2016, which was the Office of the Surveillance Commissioner. So as I said, it's quite unusual because we have inherited those to implement, which is not good practice because we need to stay outside of the system. And I will come back to you if I haven't done it.
I might be going off on a subtle tangent here, but it's sort of what you just said, Lizzie, has sort of prompted a question, because talking about Facebook, Portsmouth has probably quite a large number of what you might call community groups that use Facebook to get their messages out. I'm thinking of things like Keep Milton Village Green. One of the administrators of a Portsmouth Politics site is actually sat in the room as well. And it's probably reasonable to say that there are a lot of council officers that are members of those sorts of community forums on there. Certainly, talking about the latter, Portsmouth Politics, I know that there are some officers on there which regularly interact for a lot of reasons. Are there any protocols around that? Because strictly speaking, from what you're saying, somebody that's a member of, let's take Portsmouth Politics as an example, you can get into the profiles of people through their interaction on that particular Facebook site, like you probably can with any. You can look at the profile of the person that you're interacting with. Are we cautioning our staff about that sort of action? Because that would be a general social thing as far as I'm concerned. And I wouldn't have thought that any of the participants there would regard it as being snooping in any way, shape or form, but clearly they could potentially fall foul from what you've just said.
Can I assist with that? I mean, we have the Officer Member Code of Conduct, which attempts to lay down some guidance as to how officers and members should relate to each other. That was, of course, written well before we had any ideas about social media. Very, very few officers are subject to political restrictions in their post. People such as John and myself would be, but there's very few officers would be. We have to balance that up against the members of staff's individual rights to be able to participate in free political discussion. Therefore, as long as they're doing that sort of thing in their own private time, that's not something we should get engaged with at all.
That was where I was coming from, because I wouldn't want to stop anybody who wanted to engage politically or from a point of view of the Drayton and Farlington Parent and Toddlers Forum or something like that we've actually got. But I wouldn't want them to feel that they couldn't engage based on this that's actually come along that potentially affects council officers, and they're actually free to actually participate and say whatever they like, whether we like it or not.
In actual fact, Councillor Bowser, we've had 2 reviews to do with the use of social media. One from a how do we use it to communicate, and there were a couple of issues because we have a corporate policy with how we need to use it. In relation to forums, that is a totally different beast in that that is not individuals setting up. So a Facebook account that is used for a particular group is fine to go and have a look at. It's when it is individual accounts that there is an issue. But there will be guidance on both sides of the equation, to be honest, in the coming months to be issued around how we use it to communicate and how you may use it when you're trying to obtain information.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. So for those members of the committee that are familiar with the format, this is a report that we bring on a quarterly basis to summarise, I suppose broadly, the activities of the authority and how we would rate our performance in achieving those. There have been references to, shall we say, the comprehensive nature of the report, and certainly this is something that, you know, we go through a cycle, it slims down a bit, we add information to it, it gets bigger again. I think now we've come to the end of a year's worth of reporting, it would be very helpful if the committee were to give a steer on what they would like to see in future, whether this feels like roughly the right amount of information, whether there's something we could change, or whether there's any less required. But otherwise, happy to take general comments on the report. Generally, our practice is that there's obviously a huge amount of information about the different areas of the authority's business, so if I'm unable to answer anything at the particular time, then we'd obviously come back with more detailed information outside of the meeting. Thank you.
Yes, Chair. Probably for your benefit and Councillor Alcombe as new members of the committee, but this has been subject of discussion, certainly over the 3 or 4 years that I've been on the committee. And I can remember, I always refer back to the fact that we had very limited information coming forward on performance, and one occasion where we had adult social care saying there were no issues in adult social care, and it was no more than half a dozen pages. It has grown enormously. However, my view on this is that it's very instructive, very insightful in terms of what the council is doing, particularly from a public point of view. They can clearly access information on all departments of the council, see how they're performing, what the risks are, and clearly we have the RAG rating there as well, and there are some useful summaries in there. I think from a committee point of view, clearly we cannot go through this forensically and deal with every issue. For example, where there were particular concerns on adult social care, we invited adult social care, the director, to come along. We've also had the director of housing come along where there were issues, I think shortly after the Grenfell fire, and there were issues around fire risk assessment. So it's just a point of information, I suppose, that certainly was my view, and I think the view of the committee before about how we use this. And clearly there was an outstanding invitation, or certainly a discussion about having the Director of Education come along, and you will see from this report there are a number of issues, concerns. It's probably, in terms of the RAG rating, it's probably the one which is exercising the most concern in terms of risks. So I would put that forward as a suggestion, Chair, that we might want to have the Director of Education come along at the next meeting where we could focus on that issue in particular.
Thank you, Chairman. I mean, I sort of had a general flick through this report, but you do have to balance up between the council and having a life at times with some of these things. I guess my concern was more about the RAG rating, Kelly, in a lot of instances. And I've got two that pull out. Minor ones. This one's on page 146 for those people that are really interested. Total number of Portsmouth dogs accepted. No, not Fareham or Gosport dogs, but we're talking Portsmouth dogs.
Careful, you're being filmed.
Yeah, I'm being filmed, yes, I'm fully aware of that. The 2017 baseline was 69, and we sort of, over the 4 quarters, we've gone 57, 64, 60 and 80. Now, accepted by whom, what, where and why if we started at a baseline of 69 and we've grown to 80, is the RAG rating green? And who decides what the RAG rating should be?
More efficient are rounding them up, that's what it is.
Is it a case of, I mean, it comes back, and I use it light-heartedly because I go all the way back to the days of policy and review performance panel. And we always used to get something that, you know where I'm going with this one, Kelly, in the fact that we were always missing our targets for teenage pregnancies. And it's sort of, the way it was worded suggested that we didn't have enough. And sometimes you look at these things and you think, really, is this where this is going? You can hop on a couple of pages to page 150, and it's missed bin collections. And again, 2017, it was 10 per day. But it's grown over the course of it to 14 per day. Now, my simple look at it would say that's got to be an amber or a red because we're missing more and more bin collections. But somebody's decided it's green. So I know these are perhaps mundane little things. We're talking about dogs or missed bin collections. But the bottom line is, you know, do we have confidence in the RAG ratings that are actually going forward? Because I'm probably like other members of the committee. I will tend to look for the red ones and the amber ones first and make the assumption on a report like this that the green ones that we're doing okay. And are we in a situation, being a complete cynic, where we're burying some of them in the green ones when actually we are potentially missing some important issues?
Councillor Mason on that point.
If I might follow up on that point, we have a fascinating situation on page 140 and some of the pages following. Dwelling gas safety certificates.
Yes, exactly.
That 99.6% okay is green, but 1.1% out of date is amber. And so how can we have something which is on the one side good and on the other side amber?
Might I suggest that, that you cannot have 100% targets at any time, because if you do, it simply doesn't work, and that you might as well just set a target of 98.5%, and if you meet it, you're green, and if you don't, you're amber. And if you get down to about 85%, you're into red. Because actually it makes sense to do that, so that both, that would be green in terms of, both those would be green because they're above 98 point, whatever it is, %. I mean, it just makes sense, because otherwise it's a nonsense. I would.
But it's the contradiction which makes it a nonsense.
Absolutely, but I go slightly onto that. That I think that I'm right in saying that every single item of finance and IT is green, and we've just had a pretty execrable report on the IT section. So I perhaps what we might do is ask the Deputy Chief Executive who's sitting over there to mark their homework rather than let them do it.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. As I say, being a newbie, I actually read all 300 odd pages of this report. And at the end of it all, and all due respect to Ms Nash, I thought it was a largely pointless exercise, which I think is something Mr Brown picked up on, because, as my colleagues have said, it's a superficial read. It directs you in one direction, and they've already pointed out some examples of where green isn't green or may not be green, and I found a few as well. I won't bother going through them. And it's like, well, what actually are we achieving by wading through all this? It's telling you what's going on as a large scale paper. I don't know how many rainforests we've chopped down to print this lot, but at the end of it, reading it all, I actually thought to myself, well, have I got any more information than a load of statistics? Does it actually tell me how well we're performing in lots of areas? No, because the RAG rating is very subjective as to whether it is moving in the right direction or not. I was quite astonished, although I shouldn't have been knowing my history with the authority, that the progress between different quarters in some cases is nil or extremely slow, and maybe this committee should be looking at why some things we're asking the council to progress aren't progressing as well or as quickly as they should be, irrespective of whether they're green or not. And as I say, I'm coming from a new perspective, and I just found it very challenging to read it all. I didn't quite, and again, I'm probably a cynic, I didn't quite believe it all. I've written them in the past myself, so I know you can't believe them all. And I think it's a useful in terms of giving you an outline, but in terms of actually, for me, for this committee, telling me where we are governing and running a check on what's going on, I didn't find it as useful as I hoped.
Hasten to add, Chairman, that having questioned the RAG rating, the fact that traffic and transportation for last year is almost entirely green is very believable.
My own comment on this, I'm afraid I'm going to disagree with Councillor Elcombe. I actually, having read the whole lot, and I read reports like this quite a lot at work, I'm more in agreement with Councillor Ferret that actually I think the level of information there is quite appropriate. It is the nature of this kind of report and the size of authority that the vast quantity of what's in there will not be of particular interest to this committee at all times, but there is a danger that if you reduce this to summary reports, you get back to a situation where things are hidden and issues of concern are not picked up early enough. So I personally am of the view that this level of information is good, and then if the onus is on us to challenge and scrutinise below that. That said, that brings me to the main point that I think lots of people have highlighted. I'm not convinced by RAG ratings. I have specific concerns around having read that we've got green ratings on the hard, green ratings on the energy company, green ratings on MMD, all issues that we know at length are areas of considerable concern around assurance for this committee. So I think there's a governance issue about who decides on those RAG ratings, what level of scrutiny that is. I don't think I would drop the whole lot on Michael, but I would say that perhaps this is a discussion that should be had at executive level and agreed between directors, so that there is a critical friend approach to these ratings, not just simply marking their own homework. With that in mind, I know we've flagged a few ones. I think there's a discussion around how we structure these meetings so that we can challenge those on here that we have concerns about. I've flippantly pulled out, well, not flippantly, I have pulled out 3 there. The hard, I think, purely just because on material facts, I'd question a reg rating of green when there's significant contractual disputes going on and issues related to that. The energy company, I think it's been flagged that there is a significant risk there, and I'm looking at other members of this committee who've been here longer, but I'd struggle to believe that anyone in this committee has a good level of assurance about the risk there, or even an understanding of the risk there, and I'd want us to get more information on that as a committee, not just to understand the practicalities, the decision making that sits elsewhere, the mitigation of risk and commercial risk there, I'd want us to have a better understanding of, and we have already covered off MMD at great length. I don't know whether committee members have thoughts around how we should operate that as a committee to scrutinise those particular. This is a performance register that allows us to identify risk.
So,
That's what the RAG rating doesn't at the moment, yeah, sorry.
Chairman, I know the hard's been picked up, and obviously that's something that I've been quite closely involved in, and I'm not going to go into the specifics behind it. But if you look at it from a performance point of view, the fact that it's opening and it's functioning and it's working well, despite the fact that there's some ongoing snagging that's being monitored, then it's actually performing as it was intended. Now, I know that there are issues around the concrete apron, which are being mitigated against, but if you look at it from a performance point of view, it's doing everything that it was expected to do. So therefore, arguably, from this point of view, it's a green rating. Now, we know there are other issues, and some people have attached the cathodic to it, which is a different issue in a capital programme anyway. But those sorts of things are more to do with risk rather than performance in that respect, because it is performing as it was set out to actually do, if you see where I'm coming from. So I can understand perhaps it's a green rating or an amber rating in that, but it's not necessarily a red. But my point is it actually, and it perhaps comes back to the nature of this report in general, there are, setting aside the issues of whether the RAG rating based on performance and marking our own homework, as you put it, is appropriate in that respect. There also strikes me that there are some departments that take this a little bit more seriously than others do. And again, if I look at, and I have looked at traffic and transportation, you can also look at the public health bit, in the fact that there's pretty much a bit of detail amongst a variety of things. But there were a couple where all you've got is just meaningless figures, one figure in 4 boxes, and you think, I don't even know what that means. I think it was the housing ones I actually looked at, where they were talking about a variety of average numbers, and it's like 155.7 in one box and 175.2 in the next box, and you think, well, what the hell does that mean? Well, with respect, Kelly comes here as the author of the report and may know the information, but if she doesn't, it's down to whoever actually produced the data in the first place to explain it to us. And I think, you know, there needs to be perhaps a little, and I'm looking at the city solicitor here, I think some departments are taking this as a flippant tick box exercise, chuck a bit of information in, oh yeah, we call it green because it'll get buried in a report and we can move on to the next thing. And I think that, whereas others clearly like to explain it in a little bit more detail, and the first page from public health is a reasonably good example of somebody that's actually taken the time to actually put in something that's going to give us a little bit of detail there in its respect.
I think Kelly's keen to assist.
Yeah, happy to, Chair. I mean, I suppose I think this recognises quite a long history to the development of this, and as Councillor Bosher does, I also go back to the old days of the Policy and Review Performance Panel, and it was a very different context then, when we had very set definitions handed to us for a government of indicators, and we reported against those, and we're comparing against all other authorities, and it was very rigid. I think over time we've become much more flexible. People do set their own objectives. They set for themselves what they will be reporting. So yeah, what we've lost in some of that is some consistency and maybe some of that, I suppose, assurance that we know what people are reporting against. Equally, I think we've had a really strong steer that the directors need to be relied on, that they are giving us a correct reflection of performance. And I don't think we've necessarily had reason in the broad report to doubt that. I think what we're trying to get here is assurance that performance within the directorates is being managed, and this is the way that people demonstrate it. So whether they're saying, yes, we're collecting our key statistics and we're understanding those, or we're giving you more of a narrative about what that is, I think that assurance can be taken. So we've got to a stage now where there is good assurance. I think the next stage for the work of the committee is to get to the stage where actually you're able to now say, so which are the bits we need to pull out? I think we've stepped back from the report over the last couple of years in terms of that, you know, I think you said a collator of the report, and it has been more collation of the report because we stepped away from putting a filter over it and drawing attention to let it speak for itself. I think at the level of information we're at now and that depth of information, it's entirely reasonable for you to instruct me to start coming back with more of an editorial view on this would be something worth calling in, and we can agree perhaps at the briefing sessions that this is the way that this is the focus of an item for the meeting, for example, because I think we're now at a stage where we've got that depth of information and rigour from the department, so we can now apply that filter.
Oh, thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Kelly. You're right that obviously we can't go through everything in this, but there are a number of things. First of all, to respond to what you rightly said, yes, it means they can't hide so much, but they can hide it in plain sight instead of under. And obviously we're here to ensure that people don't hide things, or if they do, we don't imagine. Clearly, the point about this is it not only tells us what is happening, but if we think about it at any length of time, it also tells us it says what isn't there. I know, so asking the question, like, why didn't they ask Evans, for example? So I was just wondering if I could go through just a few bits that I think are raised, and interestingly, throughout these, they do flag the things that we are supposed to know about, but hopefully don't dwell too much upon, I think. Page 168, for example, we get to the end of a particular section which talks about parks and open spaces, and the objective is provision of new premises for council and contractor staff to accommodate vehicles, workshop and storage. This is an old chestnut. We've had different ways of trying to do this, but actually what's really interesting is it doesn't give you a sort of what it currently costs us to do what we're doing and what our estimated savings would be in pursuing the strategy. And it's important, I think, that we identify those things. If it's an important objective, why is it, and how the cost works. I have another question, which is simply, almost a sort of whether a RAG rating. I mean, and I spoke to Kelly earlier as well to say, can we have, if we are going to have a RAG rating at all, could it not just tell us what it is for the quarter, but what the trend is? So has it gone up? Has it gone down? And is it likely to go up or down in the future? It would be quite sensible in the next quarter. So where we know, so we actually have some idea of the trend. But page 179 is an example of where I think a green is an interesting question. When we talk about, we want to increase visitor spend of 10% over 3 years from 2016 to 2019. And then it says key progress in quarter 4, which I think means for the whole year, total expenditure estimated at £470 million, increase of 1.4%, which is green. Well, I think that 3 multiplied by 1.4 gets us nowhere near 10%. So I can't see how we're on track to do that. And I just wonder, whether or not either I've got the wrong end of the stick of what that's trying to tell us, or perhaps we're having the wool pulled over our eyes on that particular point. I would like to apologise in his absence to Chris Ward to say that everything was green in his report. It wasn't. There's one missing. There isn't a RAG rating for something on page 208. Talking about spending within allocated budgets. I think it's either because he doesn't think it gets to green, or might just be a bit amber, or could even be red. But as far as I can see, it doesn't actually tell me that it's particularly. I mean, it just doesn't. It's not helpful. So that was one. But I did actually want to point out that every other item in finance and IT is green, and I think that's amazing. I then go to page 240, And this is the IT performance metrics, and I really want to emphasise this point. Incidents. There are 522 incidents in 1 month. And we have about 30 operatives. Now, if you work that out, they're doing 40 hours work a week, apparently 37.5 hours a week. And we have 40 operatives, 522 cases. The IT company, of which I'm a director, has 4,500 and they have 14 people. 4,500 per month and they have 14 people. We have 522 incidents and 30 people doing this. It strikes me that we are simply not looking at the proper metrics of how to deal with case management within an IT department. It costs us a lot of money and it's simply not fit for purpose. But I'm not going to go on again about that, otherwise someone will think I've got a beer on it. Never. Page 218 is just my bugbear. I don't know what OPPD means, and there's nowhere that tells me what it means, and I wish that people would give us a glossary of terms, or at least put them out in one. I've gone through looking for what it means, and I can't find it anywhere, and I don't have time in a 277-page report to keep referring to something and try to find out what the hell it was. Page 239, GDPR, amber, green, green. Well, we all know we have problems with GDPR. It cannot be green. Nobody's actually green. In the whole country is green, because they don't actually know what the implications are, and they won't know for a long time precisely what matters and what doesn't. It's going to be amber at best, and probably red. So, and bearing in mind, that is our existential threat to this council. We could lose 4% of our turnover, which is what? A good few millions. And every single household in this city can sue on a sort of on PPR, just like PPR basis. They can sue us for up to £1,000 if we're holding their data. That is millions of pounds worth on the on at risk, and it's simply not mentioned. It's simply not there. But I know that they might not enforce it as heavily and as soon as people worry that they might, but eventually someone's going to come around and say, have we actually done the right kind of work? And I think that actually sums it up. I mean, basically, we need to be clear as a committee what is an existential threat to the Finances Authority, and that is mostly included in this, but it's often in what is omitted. And there can be no department in this whole city that is green the whole way through. If it is, it's not telling us things we need to know. And if it isn't, it's telling us the wrong thing.
Thank you, Chairman. A few observations. I too have read this. The first thing I'd bring up is page 80. Where we've got the Directorate of Finance and IS, risk issues for consideration. There are a number of risk issues which I think it would be wise. We've looked at cybersecurity earlier today, but the one which we have not looked at for a very long period of time is disaster recovery resilience. How well is resilience built into our systems? I think that is a proper thing for this committee to have a look at and to consider, because if a disaster occurs, we need to be up and running within 20 minutes. And are we? How is our disaster resilience? Is it fit for purpose? And I think we need to have a look at that. A second observation would be on page 159, development management. Insurer applications are dealt with, the major application type. Major applications for what we are not told, the difference between major, minor and other we are not told. There does come a time here when I would agree with Councillor Lyons, that we do need somewhat more information so we know exactly what is being referred to in these documents. I think those were the two major points which I would make at this point in the discussion zone.
Thank you, Councillor Mason. Can I propose a way forward if the committee is happy then? Two things. One, I think we are largely all in agreement about where the shortcomings are in this, in helping us to identify which are the risks, and the key elements of that is the RAG rating. I flippantly said it earlier, but I now think this is the proposal. I would like, perhaps Michael, you to come back with a proposal in advance of the next meeting to share with us about the governance of how this report should be pulled together, what are the expected standards and metrics that should be applied, and how are those RAG ratings going to be agreed by the executive, not just the departments. From a committee perspective, the way it is structured at the moment, as I understand it, is the chair's briefing 2 weeks before the meeting and then the main meeting. I would suggest extending the chair's briefing invitation to all members with a view to, at that meeting, all members having the opportunity to highlight areas within this performance management where we require further information or want answers, such that they can either be answered in preparation for the main meeting or by attendance at the main meeting. That's...
So are you suggesting actually that what you really want to do is have the chairman's briefing in two parts? So you deal with the stuff that isn't the performance stuff, and we would be invited to attend the bit that was the performance stuff, or send in our...
I was intending to invite everyone to the whole thing, to be honest, and
Okay.
part of that to cover that. I don't see that there's anything that I can have to cover that is not for the benefit of the rest of the committee. Yeah, they have to be for the chairman's briefing anyway. That's what my thinking is, that 2 weeks would allow us to look at them and say, actually, okay, off the top of my head, the three that I had concerns about this time, the HARD, the Energy Company, MMD, could pose those questions then so that further information was included before we get as far as the public report meeting. But I'm open to other suggestions.
I appreciate, Chairman, that we publish reports a week before, because that's the minimum that we actually have to do it. With things like this, where you've got 200 plus pages, the cynic might say, going beyond the RAG rating, that we're burying bad news because we know that in the space of a week with other things that councils are doing, that they're probably not going to actually have the chance to sit there and read that. Can't we extend that time when these reports are actually published in advance of the meeting? Vicky's looking at me very nervously now, but...
The statutory reporting is a week and a day before the meeting.
Yeah, but that's the statutory minimum. That doesn't mean to say you couldn't publish it.
If you're going to have a briefing, you can always publish further in advance as long as the reports are ready. If you're going to have a briefing, obviously the reports should be available to you at least a week before that briefing. So that's 3 weeks before the main meeting.
Yeah, and we achieved that pretty much.
Jim, just for your own sanity, I would put one caveat on that one of the problems that I've certainly suffered in the year I was chairman was that, having been to the chairman's briefing, I had to read the whole lot again to find out what had been changed for the next one. So it might be sensible to ask somebody kindly to ensure that you know exactly what the changes are and don't have to read the whole blooming thing again, because otherwise you really are doing double the amount of work.
Item 9, consideration of the political balance rules in relation to the constitution of subcommittees, considering complaints against members.
Members, as you will be aware, the tradition has been over the last few cycles of this committee to agree to suspend the political balance rules with regard to the consideration of members' complaints through the subcommittee process. The reasoning behind that has been so that we could have meetings which a subcommittee constituted which were cross-party, of course including the independent members were appropriate as well. Unless we do that, those subcommittees would then have to be constituted proportionately in accordance to political balance rules. And this has historically in the past been seen as not the best approach to take. If members are willing to follow this particular route, what we will do once you have passed the recommendation, which must be passed unanimously. If there's one dissenting vote, then we cannot do it. Vicky and I will ensure that whenever we're having any of the panels, either those which are assisting the initial filtering panel or the subcommittees, we will do our very best to always ensure that those are cross-party. That is always subject to members' availability, which can sometimes be a bit of an issue. But it's one for you to decide, members, and that decision, if that's the one which you make, will remain until the constitution of this committee at any time in the future changes, at which stage I will bring back the report again.
I understand it, Michael, again, going back to when I used to do this, isn't this the same thing that it comes forward almost on an annual basis, just after, so that we don't get sucked into what gets agreed at full council on annual council day, which is the proportionalisation of committees, that this is regularly brought forward purely and simply to set us aside from that particular council ruling?
Without this, it must be politically proportionate.
Yeah.
I personally have no objections to disapplying it, but I'm open. I assume we have to formally vote on it, do we, in order to... Exactly. All those in favour of disapplying it?
Sorry, I just want to know, having read this, I cannot see anything in it that is remotely prejudicial to the council. It just demonstrates that there are faults that occur in any period of time. That could happen in any organisation. It reflects on nobody. Every single item is redacted. We don't know who's concerned. We just know it's happened, and I cannot imagine why we have this as an exempt paper.
I have to agree. I think on reflection, it's become the standard. That's not right. We should have actually checked the report in detail. And I have to agree with Councillor Lyon. I cannot see any reason why, in fact, the report as set out, I cannot see that there's anything in there which would reveal the personal identity of any individual.
In that case, can I ask that if somebody wants to have, if we're going to make these no longer exempt, that those who have attended the meeting and want to see the papers may? In which case we don't go into
We'll
exempt
publish
session.
it after this meeting.
In which case, moving on to item 11, we can have a discussion about it, not in exempt session. Any questions, comments from members on item 11? Good point.
If you just don't pass the resolution, and I've undertaken to make the report public after the meeting, you're okay.
Councillor Ferret.
Yeah, it was just on item 1. There is no, there's nothing there about the ICO being
sorry,
informed.
Noticed that. I'll check what the position was. I'm quite confident the ICO wasn't informed. Can I just point out something which might help members in understanding this report? Even whenever data breaches occur, we don't automatically report all of those data breaches to the ICO because they're not always considered to be worthy of reporting. One of the factors which we're obliged to take into account with the guidance which the ICO issues is that if the breach which has taken place, for instance, a breach was taken place, and you've seen a couple here, there's a couple of instances, there's a legal file which was misdirected, and there was a laptop which was stolen, both of which were encrypted, therefore there is no particular breach. Another matter which we take into account whenever considering whether or not to actually report the breach is, has any harm occurred to an individual? Some occasions, in fact, the individual whose data has been revealed, because it's important not to cause unnecessary or undue distress to individuals. The guidance is that you sometimes don't actually, and exceptionally I have to say, tell the individual that there has been a data breach. This would occur when the information we have managed to relatively safely recover, and we are confident that it hasn't actually gone outside the organisation or gone to somebody who may misuse it. Sometimes there may be data breaches internally where an email will be sent to a wrong addressee within PCC. That's not going to be a concern. We do value our staff, and they all have been trained around this particular area, and as long as the information hasn't gone to some external body, then that information would not result in a data breach that would be worthy of reporting. Having said that, because the GDPR was brought in 25th of May, we're now under a much stricter regime, and in future I think you will find that we are having to report breaches more readily. We now are obliged to really report breaches in a much more rigid way than we did in the past, and those breaches have to be reported within 72 hours of a breach being known to us.
Thank you, Chairman. This is an interesting question in terms of who reports what and how. I happen to know of an incident in another authority of which I think our Deputy Chief Executive might have a role, but I'm certain doesn't know about this, where an individual had his details disclosed by somebody who was working in housing in that particular authority and knew the person concerned and told her mother about it, who then accosted that person on the street. Now, I don't know what a recourse there would be in that authority, but what would happen in this one? I mean, if he was in Portsmouth and reported that incident, what would be the process and what would be the redress?
As soon as we become aware that there has been a data breach, any member of staff, they're obliged to report that. It is a condition of their employment. They must report that to their manager. The manager then must refer that up to the data protection officer, who is Helen Magri, who works very closely with me in my role as monitoring officer. And we will then make the decision whether or not to report. Almost inevitably in that sort of circumstance, I would anticipate it, we would have been looking at reporting it. We will also, when we do report, and if it has been clear that there has been an intentional breach, on each and every occasion disciplinary action will follow. And I have given the advice to my colleagues in relation to these matters that we must always consider, when there has been an intentional data breach, that we should always consider every sanction against the employee up to and including dismissal. So we take these matters very seriously.
And what about redress for the person whose data has been misused in this way?
Yeah, we'll look at that. But
so does it involve financial redress, or does it?
There can be, and there has been.
Thank you, Chair. I presume that people staff who've caused data breaches are given some form of operational advice as to the way they should perform in future. For example, the person whose laptop was stolen from the back of a car, how long have the police and other people been saying, put valuables in the boot or take them with you? So it's not only neglect, it's stupidity in one way. And, you know, if it hadn't been recovered, presumably the member of staff would have had to pay for a replacement, I hope.
Well, a laptop basic costs £1,000 to the authority, so it's a very high loss of an item, and certainly we would consider that as a possibility with the member staff. Interestingly, in those circumstances, in occasion where, and one is reported to you here, that a laptop was stolen and also a bag of information, the danger was not with regard, from a data protection point of view, the danger was not with regard to the laptop, and that was not reportable in itself, because the laptop was encrypted to a very high standard, that one which satisfies the Information Commissioner. In this occasion, the concern was in relation to the paper which was stolen, because that was readily accessible to someone. Luckily, that was almost immediately recovered, because the person we suspect who stole the two items, of course, the value to them was in the encrypted laptop, not in the paper. We do give guidance to staff, and we give quite specific guidance to staff as well, saying that if there are instances such as that, taking paper files out of the building, which there should be very few occasions nowadays when they need to do that, because most information is held electronically, and taking something in digital format on a laptop or a memory stick, the two items should be held separately, because we know from practice that people will steal laptops but will rarely steal a bag full of paper.
Perhaps I just would add that certainly when I was Chair of Governance and Audit, the audit team carried out a bit, Michael's nodding, a bit of a minesweep of left laptops unattended around the building and just quietly removed them, and then the appropriate owner, once they realised it had gone missing, had to go through a walk of shame to actually go and reclaim their laptop, which I think actually included a very, very senior manager who actually sent his PA to go and do the walk of shame, which I think was a bit naughty, but it is taken seriously, and I trust that that sort of stuff does still happen occasionally, to make sure that people, because it's not just about cars. I think Councillor Elcombe is quite right. I mean, there is plenty of advice out there, and I'd like to think that people, when it comes to leaving valuables like that in cars, tend to be a little bit more robust about it. but certainly around an open plan building, people are very, I'm just going to wander off and get myself a coffee and chat to somebody down the other end of the corridor and leave my laptop open on the desk that I'm working at. It tends to happen more here, I would have thought, than out there.
We have that still on an annual basis. We don't even tell our director. In actual fact, I'm not even told when it's undertaken. We still seize the equipment. Well, we still seize. The levels have decreased slightly. I'd like to ask whether Audit can keep the items of equipment that are better than our items of equipment, if at all possible. But I appreciate that might not be viable.
Any other questions from members on this item? Councillor Oakham.
Thank you, Chair. Somewhere in this tome, I came across a reference to staff satisfaction, staff in terms of how they feel valued, etc., which I thought were unfortunately extremely low. And I wondered, obviously, pay and the pay restraints we've gone through lately have probably had an impact on that. But I wondered what work the authority is doing in trying to improve staff morale. I think that it was as low as 60% on one and 50-odd% on another.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite a wide question. I mean, I suppose the first thing to say is that it does vary massively across the organisation. There's some areas where that number comes to extremely high, somewhere it comes to extremely low. I think, and bizarre though it sounds, I mean, whilst 60% sounds low, actually compared to a lot of organisations, it actually isn't all that low, but that definitely doesn't give us reason for complacency. We've done quite a lot of work in HR since the last employee opinion survey was done to try and understand the reasons for some of that. Some of it's certainly about kind of communication and people understanding what's going on. Some of it's about change. Certainly there is a certain amount about pay and terms and conditions, etc. So obviously the things that we can do something about, we're working with managers in those areas to do that. There are some things we can't do an awful lot about unless there's a very large checkbook kicking around. But I think the reality is actually, whilst I mean all the research on this obviously shows that whilst pay is an issue in avoiding people getting very grumpy, it's not actually an issue in making people highly motivated and engaged in the organisation. That's much more about how people feel they're being managed and opportunities they've got to develop and those kind of things, which is really where we're trying to put the emphasis.
Is which departments are particularly low and which are particularly high, if that's possible.
Yeah, I was just going to say it is probably more a matter for Employment Committee. The survey's done every year, and the next one's due to be carried out fairly shortly, and the results of that will be taken to Employment Committee with all the necessary analysis around it to the members of that committee.
Thank you. In which case that concludes today's meeting. Thank you very much.